September 19th, 1952, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Queen Elizabeth cut through black water at 3 in the morning, her engines humming a low, constant note that most passengers had long since stopped hearing. But Charlie Chaplin heard everything that night. He stood alone on the first-class deck, a small figure in an expensive coat, watching the darkness where the sky met the sea. Behind him lay New York Harbor, already hundreds of miles away. Ahead lay Southampton and the London premiere of his newest film. He was 63 years old, and he could not sleep. In his cabin below, his wife Una lay with their 4 children, all of them dreaming whatever children dream when crossing an ocean. She was 27. He had been famous before her mother was born. These mathematics no longer troubled him. What troubled him was something else entirely, a feeling he could not name, a sense that he was sailing away from more than just a country. He did not know that at this very moment, in a radio room 3 decks below, an operator was transcribing a message that would change everything. In Washington, D.C., Attorney General James McGranery had just signed an order. The document was brief and bureaucratic, the kind of paper that destroys lives without raising its voice. It revoked the re-entry permit of one Charles Spencer Chaplin, resident alien, on grounds of moral turpitude and suspected communist sympathies. The world's most recognized face had just been erased from the country that made him. The comedian did not know this yet. He stood at the railing, thinking perhaps of the film In the Ship's Hold, the reels of limelight that told the story of an aging performer who knows his time has passed. He had written it, directed it, scored it, starred in it. In the film, his character dies at the end, slumping in the wings while a younger generation takes the stage. Art imitating life, or prophecy dressed as entertainment. What he could not have known was that in a government office building, a man named Edgar Hoover was savoring this moment. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had pursued this particular target for 30 years. 22 agents across 3 countries had compiled a file that now exceeded 2,000 pages. Every phone call tapped, every letter opened, every friend interrogated. Tonight, Hoover had finally won. But here is what history often forgets. The Kennington survivor at the railing was not surprised. Not really. He had been expecting something like this for years. His money had already been transferred to European banks. His wife knew exactly what to do if the worst happened. The child who had known hunger, who had watched his mother dragged away to an asylum, who had clawed his way from absolute poverty to unimaginable wealth, this man had always known how to disappear. The question that haunted that night, and haunts us still, is not a simple one. How does a man who taught the entire world to laugh become the most dangerous person in America? What sins did the little tramp commit to deserve exile from the nation that had worshipped him? To understand that night on the Atlantic, we must travel back 63 years, to a London slum where a 5-year-old boy first learned that laughter could save your life. The Aldershot Canteen was not a glamorous venue. It was a military entertainment hall, the kind of place where soldiers drank cheap beer and watched performers who had seen better days, or who had never seen good days at all. On this particular evening in 1894, a woman named Hannah Chaplin was singing. She had been beautiful once, or so the photographs suggest. Dark hair, large eyes, a face made for the stage. She had performed under the name Lily Harley in better music halls than this one, had known modest success, had married a man who promised her everything and delivered nothing. Now she was 30 years old, abandoned, raising 2 boys alone, and her voice was failing. It happened mid-song, a crack, a waver, then nothing. The notes simply stopped coming. The soldiers began to murmur, then to laugh, but not the kind of laughter any performer wants. Hannah stood frozen under the gaslights, her mouth opening and closing, no sound emerging. Someone pushed a small boy onto the stage. He was 5 years old, undersized even for his age, with dark curly hair and eyes that seemed too large for his face. He wore clothes that had been mended too many times. He looked out at the crowd of soldiers, these rough men with their beer and their mockery, and something happened. He began to sing. The song was a popular tune of the day, something his mother had taught him. His voice was thin but clear, and then halfway through he did something that would define the rest of his life. He began to imitate the other performers he had watched from the wings: a pompous tenor, a drunk comedian, a lady singer with too many feathers. The soldiers began to laugh, but differently now. They were laughing with him, not at him. Coins began to rain onto the stage. The boy stopped singing and started collecting them, stuffing them into his pockets, his shirt, anywhere they would fit. This got an even bigger laugh. When he finally left the stage, he had more money than his mother would have earned for her entire performance. Hannah Chaplin never sang professionally again. Her son had just given his first performance. His name was Charles Spencer Chaplin, born April 16, 1889, in East Street, Walworth, in the south of London. The address no longer exists. The building was demolished long ago, replaced by the kind of anonymous structure that could be anywhere. But in 1889, it was a cramped room in a cramped neighborhood, where the smell of horse manure mixed with coal smoke and gin, where children played in gutters and died of diseases that no longer have names. 4 days after his birth, in a town called Braunau am Inn, on the Austrian side of the border with Germany, another boy was born. His name was Adolf Hitler. The coincidence means nothing, of course. History is full of coincidences. But both boys would grow up to wear the same small mustache, and one day, one of them would mock the other before the entire world. Charlie's father was also named Charles Chaplin, a music hall singer of moderate talent and immoderate thirst. He had married Hannah in 1885, but the marriage was troubled from the start. There may have been another man. There was certainly too much alcohol. By the time Charlie was 3 years old, his father had left the family for good. The departure was not dramatic. There was no final argument, no slammed door that the boy would remember forever. His father simply stopped coming home. Charlie would see him occasionally on the streets of Kennington, usually drunk, usually with a woman who was not his mother. They would nod at each other, these strangers who shared a name and nothing else. But Hannah tried. She took in sewing. She pawned everything that could be pawned. She moved the family from room to room, each one smaller and cheaper than the last, always one step ahead of landlords demanding rent she did not have. Charlie and his older half-brother Sidney learned to recognize the signs. When Mother started looking at the furniture with a certain expression, it meant another trip to the pawn shop. When she started talking too fast, her eyes too bright, it meant something worse was coming. The first time they took her away, Charlie was 9 years old. He remembered it for the rest of his life. The men in dark coats who came to the door, his mother singing softly, not understanding what was happening, Sidney trying to explain something to the men, his voice cracking. And then she was gone, led down the street toward a carriage that would take her to Cane Hill Asylum. The diagnosis, when it came, was madness caused by syphilis and malnutrition. Modern doctors suspect the syphilis diagnosis was wrong, a catch-all explanation for any woman who behaved strangely. The malnutrition was certainly real. Hannah Chaplin had been slowly starving herself to feed her children. With their mother in the asylum and their father a stranger, Charlie and Sidney were sent to the Lambeth workhouse. The workhouse system was Victorian England's answer to poverty, and it was designed to be as unpleasant as possible. The theory was simple. If you made poverty sufficiently miserable, poor people would somehow stop being poor. The workhouses were not prisons exactly. You could leave if you had somewhere to go, but if you had somewhere to go, you would not be in a workhouse in the first place. Charlie was 7 years old when he first passed through those doors. He remembered the smell for the rest of his life. Carbolic soap and boiled cabbage and something else, something that might have been despair. They took his clothes and gave him a uniform. They shaved his head. They separated him from Sidney because the workhouse kept boys of different ages apart. The rules were endless. No talking during meals, no running in the corridors, no crying after lights out. The food was barely enough to survive on, and the work was designed to be pointless. Boys picked oakum, pulling apart old ropes until their fingers bled for no reason except to keep them busy. The message was clear. You are here because you failed. You deserve nothing. Charlie learned to survive. He learned to be invisible when invisibility was required, and visible when visibility might earn him an extra piece of bread. He learned to make the other boys laugh, because boys who made people laugh were less likely to be beaten. He learned that performance was not just entertainment, it was armor. Later, he and Sydney were transferred to the Hanwell School for orphans and destitute children. It was marginally better than the workhouse. There were lessons of a sort. There was a little more food, but the essential lesson remained the same. The world did not care about boys like them. If they wanted to survive, they would have to do it themselves. There is a story from these years that Charlie told throughout his life, though the details sometimes changed. He was living with a foster family, one of the temporary arrangements that punctuated his childhood. He was hungry, desperately hungry, the kind of hunger that makes it impossible to think about anything else. He saw a pair of boots outside a shop, and next to them, a basket of eggs. He took them. The foster mother caught him. She was furious, terrified of what the authorities might do. "They'll put you in prison," she said. "They'll lock you away." The boy looked at her with those two large eyes. "I saw them and I was hungry," he said, "so I took them." It was not an apology. It was not a justification. It was simply a statement of fact. Hunger existed. Food existed. The connection between them was obvious. Morality was a luxury for people who had enough to eat. Hannah came home eventually. She always did for a while. There would be months of fragile normalcy, mother and sons together in some rented room pretending that everything was fine. Then the signs would start again. The talking too fast, the eyes too bright, the songs that made no sense, and the men in dark coats would come again. Charles Chaplin Sr. died in 1901. They found him in a lodging house, alone, killed by the drink that had always mattered more to him than his sons. He was 37 years old. Charlie was 12. He did not attend the funeral. There was nothing to mourn. You cannot lose what you never had. But the death changed something. The last thread connecting Charlie to any idea of a father was severed. From now on, he would have to be his own father, his own family, his own everything. Sydney had joined the merchant navy, escaping to sea because the sea was better than London. Charlie was alone. But he had discovered something. He could make people laugh, and people who laughed sometimes gave you money or food or simply left you alone. It was not much of a discovery, but it was enough. The years between 1898 and 1910 were a slow climb out of darkness. Charlie worked whatever jobs he could find. He was a doctor's assistant, a glass blower's helper, a newsboy, a barber's errand runner. None of them lasted. None of them were meant to last. They were just ways to eat while he figured out what he was actually going to do. What he was going to do, it turned out, was perform. The Lancashire Lads were a clog dancing troupe, the kind of act that filled the lower half of music hall bills across England. They needed a small boy who could move well and learn quickly. Charlie was small, he could move, and he had been learning quickly his entire life. He joined the troupe and discovered that he was good at this. Not just adequate, good. From the Lancashire Lads, he moved to legitimate theater. A touring production of Sherlock Holmes needed a boy to play Billy the page boy. Charlie got the part and kept it for 2.5 years, traveling across England and eventually to America. He was not the star. He was barely a supporting player, but he was learning. Every night he watched the lead actors from the wings, studying how they moved, how they timed their lines, how they held an audience. And then came Fred Carnot. The Carnot Company was the Oxford University of physical comedy. Fred Carnot himself was a former plumber who had built an entertainment empire on pratfalls and sight gags. His troupe toured constantly, performing elaborate sketches that required split-second timing and absolute physical control. The pay was decent, the training was brutal, and the alumni would go on to reshape comedy forever. Charlie joined the Carno Company in 1908. He was 19 years old, still small, still hungry in ways that had nothing to do with food. He learned everything Carno could teach him: how to take a fall without getting hurt, how to time a look for maximum effect, how to make an audience laugh before you had done anything at all, just by the way you walked onto the stage. There was another young comedian in the Carno troupe, a thin Englishman named Arthur Stanley Jefferson. He and Charlie became friends, sharing rooms in cheap boarding houses, talking about comedy late into the night. Arthur would later change his name to Stan Laurel and become half of the most famous comedy duo in history. But that was years away. For now, they were just two young men trying to figure out how to be funny. In 1910, the Carno Company sailed to America for a tour. Charlie had been to America once before, briefly, with the Sherlock Holmes production. But this was different. This time, he was a featured performer. This time, people were paying specifically to see him. America was overwhelming. The buildings were taller than anything in London. The streets were wider. The people were louder. Everything seemed to move faster, as if the entire country was in a hurry to get somewhere. Charlie watched it all with those careful eyes, filing everything away. The tour was a success. The Carno Company returned to England, then came back to America again in 1912. And this time, someone was watching. His name was Max Sennett, and he ran a film studio called Keystone. The movies were still new, still disreputable, still considered a lower form of entertainment than the stage. But Sennett saw something in the young English comedian. He saw someone who understood physical comedy at a molecular level, who could communicate without words, who had a face that the camera loved. The telegram arrived in 1913. It offered $150 a week, more money than Charlie had ever seen. He accepted immediately. The future remained hidden, as futures always do. He could not have imagined that within 3 years he would become the highest-paid performer on the planet, or that the same hunger driving his success would eventually drive his destruction. He knew only that America was offering him a chance, and he was going to take it. The Keystone Studio in 1914 was chaos organized into something resembling a film factory. Max Sennett produced comedies the way other men produce sausages, quickly and in large quantities with little concern for artistry. The formula was simple: put funny people in front of a camera, have them fall down, get hit with pies, chase each other around, ship the result to theaters across the country. Charlie's first film was called Making a Living. He played a villain with a top hat and a monocle, the kind of character he had seen 100 times in music halls. He hated it. The film was crude, the character was borrowed, and nothing about it felt like him. His second film would be different. The story goes like this. Sennett needed a comedian for a scene at a children's auto race in Venice, California. He told Charlie to put on something funny and get in front of the camera. Charlie walked into the wardrobe room and started grabbing things. He took a pair of pants that belonged to Fatty Arbuckle, a comedian who weighed nearly 300 pounds. The pants were enormous. He took a coat that was too small, possibly belonging to another actor named Ford Sterling. He found a pair of size 14 shoes and put them on the wrong feet, so they splayed outward when he walked. He added a small derby hat, too small for his head. And then, looking in a mirror, he added one final touch: a small rectangle of crepe hair under his nose, a toothbrush mustache. He walked out of the wardrobe room, and the tramp walked with him. "I had no idea of the character," he said later. "But the moment I was dressed, the clothes and the makeup made me feel the person he was. I began to know him, and by the time I walked onto the stage, he was fully born." The character was a contradiction in every detail. The pants were too big, the coat too small. The shoes were enormous, the hat tiny. The mustache suggested dignity, but the clothes suggested poverty. He was a gentleman and a vagrant, proud and pathetic, graceful and ridiculous. He was everyone who had ever been knocked down by life and gotten back up again. The film was called Kid Auto Races at Venice. It was released on February 7, 1914. It was 6 minutes long, shot in less than an hour, and it introduced a character that would become more recognizable than any president, any king, any religious figure of the 20th century. Within months, Charlie was directing his own films. Within a year, he had moved to a new studio for more money. Within 2 years, he signed a contract with the Mutual Film Corporation for $670,000. Within 3 years, he signed another contract for over $1 million, making him arguably the highest-paid person in the world. Hannah's son had become a king. For 3 years, he was untouchable. Film after film, triumph after triumph. The money poured in faster than he could spend it, and yet something was missing. The performer who had lost his mother sought something he could not name, a family, a home, someone who would not leave. He found it, or thought he found it, at a party in 1918. The gathering was at Samuel Goldwyn's mansion, the kind of event where the new Hollywood royalty came to see and be seen. Charlie was 29 years old, famous beyond comprehension, wealthy beyond imagination. He had everything a man could want, except the one thing that had been taken from him as a child. Mildred Harris was across the room, wearing white. She was 16 years old, a child actress who had been in film since she was 11. She had blonde hair and a sweet face, and the kind of innocence that Hollywood manufactured and consumed in equal measure. Charlie watched her. She looked up. Their eyes met. What happened next followed a pattern that would repeat throughout his life, a compulsion so consistent that it seems less like coincidence than something darker. The older man, the teenage girl, the pursuit, the possession, the destruction. Mildred believed she was pregnant. Whether this was true or a mistake or a deliberate deception, no one knows for certain. What is certain is that Charlie married her on October 23, 1918. She was 16. He was 29. The wedding was quiet, almost secret, as if both of them knew it was a mistake even as they made it. The pregnancy, if there ever was one, did not last, but another pregnancy followed, a real one this time. On July 7, 1919, Mildred gave birth to a son. They named him Norman Spencer Chaplin. The baby was malformed. The doctors used words that meant nothing and everything. There was no hope. There had never been any hope. Norman Spencer Chaplin lived for 3 days. Charlie's response to his son's death became part of his legend, though not the part he would have chosen. He was cold, witnesses said, distant. He went back to work almost immediately, as if nothing had happened. Mildred was devastated, but her husband seemed untouched. Perhaps he was. Or perhaps the child who had survived the workhouse had also learned to bury his grief so deep that even he could not find it. Perhaps the man who made the world laugh had forgotten how to cry. The marriage collapsed within months. The divorce was bitter and public, the first of many scandals that would follow Charlie Chaplin through his life. Mildred told reporters that her husband had been cold, cruel, absent. He told reporters nothing, because he had learned that silence was sometimes the only defense. She would try to rebuild her career after the divorce, but the studios were not interested. She took small roles, then smaller ones, then none at all. She married twice more, divorced twice more. She died in 1944 at 42 years old of pneumonia following surgery. The newspapers gave her death a single paragraph. Former wife of Charlie Chaplin, the headlines read, even in death she was defined by him. But that grief was 25 years away. In 1920, Charlie was 31 years old, divorced, childless, and more famous than ever. He had survived his first scandal. He had learned that the public would forgive almost anything if you made them laugh. He had not learned nearly enough. On the set of a film called The Kid, there was a 12-year-old girl working as an extra. Her name was Lilita McMurray, and she had dark hair and large eyes and a face that reminded some people of Hannah in her youth. He noticed her, he filed her away, and 4 years later she would nearly destroy him. But that story would have to wait. First, there was a masterpiece to make and a mother to save and a world to conquer. The premiere of The Kid took place in January 1921, and nothing in Hollywood had prepared anyone for what happened that night. The crowds began gathering hours before the doors opened. Police struggled to maintain order. When the film finally began, the audience did not know how to react. They had come expecting comedy, the pratfalls and pie fights that had made the little tramp famous. What they got was something else entirely. A story about poverty and abandonment, about a man who finds an orphan child and raises him as his own, about the terror of having something precious taken away. The comedy was there, of course. The tramp and the kid running a scam together, breaking windows and then offering to repair them. The absurdist sequences that only Charlie could choreograph. But underneath the laughter was something raw and painful, something that felt like memory rather than invention. When the film ended, grown men were weeping. They did not quite understand why. They had come to laugh and they had laughed, but they were leaving with something heavier in their chests. The Kid was not just entertainment. It was confession disguised as comedy, autobiography wrapped in fiction. The child actor was named Jackie Coogan, and he was 6 years old. He had been discovered by Charlie in a vaudeville theater, a tiny performer with perfect timing and no fear of the camera. Their chemistry on screen was immediate and electric. Critics would later note that Charlie had never seemed so human, so vulnerable, as when he was acting opposite this child. What they did not know, what perhaps Charlie himself did not fully understand, was that he was not just directing a film. He was rewriting his own childhood. The tramp finds an abandoned baby and keeps him, raises him, loves him. When the authorities come to take the child away, the tramp fights them with everything he has. He climbs across rooftops. He risks everything. He refuses to let go. Charlie had watched his mother taken away when he was 9 years old. He had been powerless to stop it. In The Kid, he gave himself the ending he had never had. He got the child back. He won. The film made more money than any comedy in history. It established Charlie not just as a performer, but as an artist, someone whose work meant something beyond the laughter. And it gave him the resources to do something he had been planning for years. He brought his mother home. Hannah Chaplin arrived in California in 1921. She was 56 years old, and she had spent much of the past 2 decades in and out of asylums. Her mind came and went like weather. Some days she recognized her famous son. Other days she thought he was a stranger or confused him with people who had been dead for years. Charlie built her a house near the sea, hired nurses to care for her around the clock, visited when he could bear it. She would sit in the garden, this woman who had once sung in music halls, and sometimes she would sing again, fragments of songs from another century. She did not understand that her son had become the most celebrated entertainer alive. She did not understand much of anything anymore. The early 1920s were the years of his greatest power. United Artists, the studio he had founded with Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith in 1919, gave him complete creative control. No one could tell him what to do. No one could edit his films or change his vision. He was answerable to no one except audiences, and audiences loved him unconditionally. He traveled to Europe in 1921 and was received like visiting royalty. In London, crowds lined the streets just to catch a glimpse of him. In Paris, intellectuals debated the meaning of his work. In Berlin, he met with artists and thinkers who saw in the tramp a symbol of something larger, the common man struggling against forces beyond his control. He met H.G. Wells, who found him fascinating. He met Winston Churchill, who invited him to dinner. Years later, he would meet Albert Einstein, who told him that his fame was greater than Einstein's own because everyone understood what Charlie did, while almost no one understood relativity. But fame is a strange companion. It illuminates and it isolates. Charlie was surrounded by people at all times, yet fundamentally alone. He could not walk down a street without being recognized. He could not have a private meal or a private thought. The mask of the tramp had become his public face, and removing it was increasingly difficult. The affairs multiplied. Pola Negri, the Polish actress, staged an elaborate public romance with him that may or may not have been genuine. Edna Purviance, his leading lady in dozens of films, loved him quietly and without expectation. He supported her financially for the rest of her life, long after she stopped appearing in his pictures. There were others, always others, a procession of women whose names blurred together. And then there was the girl from The Kid. Lolita McMurray had grown up. She was 15 years old now, and she wanted to be a star. Her mother wanted it even more. When Charlie began casting for his new film, The Gold Rush, Lolita auditioned and won the lead role. She would play the dance hall girl who captures the tramp's heart. Production began in 1924. Almost immediately there were rumors. The director and his leading lady were spending time together off-set, private meetings, closed doors. She was 15. He was 35. The rumors were true. What happened next would become one of the most infamous episodes in Hollywood history. A scandal so explosive that it nearly ended the career of the most celebrated comedian in the world. Lolita became pregnant. She was 15 years old. In California, the age of consent was 18. What Charlie had done was not just immoral, it was illegal. Statutory rape carried a prison sentence of up to 30 years. Lolita's mother knew exactly what she had. She hired lawyers. She made demands. And Charlie, faced with the choice between prison and marriage, chose marriage. The wedding took place in Mexico on November 26, 1924. Lolita was 16 years old. She had already chosen her stage name, the name by which history would remember her: Lita Gray. Charlie could not bear to look at her on their wedding night. He told her, according to her later testimony, that he had made the worst mistake of his life. The honeymoon was a disaster. The marriage that followed was worse. She was replaced in The Gold Rush. The official explanation was that her pregnancy made filming impossible. The real explanation was that Charlie could not stand to see her face. Georgia Hale took over the role and gave a luminous performance. The film became a masterpiece, featuring one of the most celebrated scenes in cinema history. The scene required the tramp to eat a boot. The prop department made it from licorice, the laces from pasta, the nails from candy. Charlie ate take after take, 63 in all, until the scene was perfect. He twirled the laces like spaghetti, sucked the nails like chicken bones, approached the soul with the delicacy of a gourmet. He was sick for days afterward. Comedy, he understood, required suffering. Meanwhile, at home, Lita Gray was living in what she would later describe as a prison. She gave birth to their first son, Charles Spencer Chaplin Jr., on May 5, 1925. She was still 16 years old. A second son, Sidney Earl Chaplin, followed on March 30, 1926. The boys would grow up to struggle with their father's shadow. Charles Jr. would become an alcoholic, would write a bitter memoir about his childhood, would die at 42 from a blood clot. Sidney would fare somewhat better, earning a Tony nomination on Broadway, living until 2009. But both would carry the weight of being Charlie Chaplin's sons, of being not quite enough, of being reminders of a marriage their father wanted to forget. Something else happened during this marriage that remained hidden for decades. One of the children's birth dates was falsified. Charlie paid a doctor $25,000 to alter the records, pushing the date forward to obscure the timeline of conception, to hide the evidence of exactly when the relationship had become physical. It was a small crime in the ledger of his life, but it spoke to a larger truth. He knew what he had done. He knew it was wrong, and he paid to make the evidence disappear. The marriage lasted 2 years. It ended in January 1927, with a divorce filing that shook Hollywood to its foundations. Lita Gray's divorce complaint was 50 pages long. It contained accusations so explicit that copies were sold on street corners like pornography. She alleged that her husband had demanded what she called perverted sexual acts. She alleged that he had threatened her. She alleged that he had been cold to their children, indifferent to her suffering, cruel in ways both large and small. The document named 5 women with whom Charlie had allegedly been intimate during their marriage. It described in clinical detail the sexual practices he had demanded. It painted a portrait of a monster, a man who used his power and fame to exploit and abuse. Charlie collapsed. He stopped eating. He could not sleep. He checked into a hospital, suffering from what his doctors called nervous exhaustion. For a moment, it seemed possible that the scandal would destroy him entirely. The settlement was enormous, $825,000, plus additional costs that pushed the total close to $1 million. It was the largest divorce settlement in American history at that time. Lita Gray had won. But winning came at a cost. She was blacklisted in Hollywood, unable to find work. She would struggle financially for decades. She would marry again, divorce again, watch her sons inherit their father's demons. She lived until 1995, giving interviews until the end, never quite forgiving, never quite forgetting. There is a footnote to this story that deserves attention. A young writer named Vladimir Nabokov read about the Lita Gray divorce. He noted the ages involved, the power dynamics, the way an older man had pursued and possessed a child. Years later, he would write a novel about a middle-aged man obsessed with a young girl. The girl's name in the early drafts was similar to Lita Gray's real name, Lolita. The novel was called Lolita. Hannah Chaplin died in August 1928. Charlie wept at her graveside. He had saved her from the asylum, brought her to California, given her everything money could buy. But he could not give her back her mind. She died not knowing that her son had become the greatest entertainer of his age. Perhaps that was a mercy. Perhaps it was the final cruelty of a life that had contained too many cruelties already. Charlie survived the scandal, as he had survived the workhouse, as he had survived everything. The public memory was short, and his talent was long. By late 1928, he was at work on a new film, his most ambitious yet. It would be called City Lights, and it would become his masterpiece. But first, he had to confront an enemy more terrifying than any scandal. An enemy that was destroying careers across Hollywood. An enemy that threatened everything he had built. Sound had come to the movies. October 6, 1927. The Jazz Singer premiered in New York. Al Jolson looked into the camera and spoke. Wait a minute, he said. You ain't heard nothing yet." He was right. The audience had heard nothing yet, but they were about to hear everything. The transition to sound was brutal and swift. Within 2 years, silent films were essentially dead. Careers that had been built on pantomime and physical grace collapsed overnight. Stars who had been worshipped were suddenly obsolete, their thick accents or thin voices unsuitable for the new technology. Charlie refused to adapt. It was not stubbornness exactly, or rather it was stubbornness in service of something deeper. The tramp could not speak. The character existed in silence, communicated through gesture and expression, transcended language barriers. The tramp was universal precisely because he was silent. Give him a voice, and he would become merely local, merely specific, merely one man in one country speaking one language. Charlie understood this instinctively. The tramp was bigger than sound. The tramp was bigger than any technology. And so, in 1928, he began production on a silent film in a talking world. Everyone told him he was mad. The studios had converted entirely to sound. Theaters were being rewired. Audiences wanted to hear their stars speak. A silent film in 1931 would be a relic, a curiosity, a guaranteed failure. Charlie did not listen. He never listened when he knew he was right. City Lights told a simple story. The tramp falls in love with a blind flower girl. He discovers that an operation could restore her sight, but it costs $1,000, a fortune for a vagrant. He schemes and struggles to get the money. He gets it, through a complicated series of events involving a drunken millionaire who is his friend when intoxicated and forgets him when sober. He gives her the money and is arrested for theft. when he is released from prison. Months later, the flower girl has her sight. She has opened a flower shop. She is waiting for the wealthy benefactor she imagines saved her. The tramp passes by the shop. She sees him and laughs at the pathetic little man. Then she touches his hand, offering him a flower out of pity, and she recognizes him, not by sight but by touch. The hand that gave her money, the hand that saved her. The final shot is of the tramp's face looking at him. He holds a flower to his mouth, half hiding behind it. His expression is impossible to describe. Hope and fear, joy and terror. The knowledge that she can see him now, really see him, and the question that comes with that knowledge. Will she still love him? Can anyone love him once they truly see what he is? The shot lasts only a few seconds. It contains more emotion than most films manage in their entire running time. Critics have called it the greatest close-up in cinema history. Audiences wept when they saw it. They still weep today. The premiere was held on January 30th, 1931. Albert Einstein attended as Charlie's guest. The scientist and the comedian sat side by side, watching the flower girl touch the tramp's hand. When the lights came up, Einstein was crying. Outside the theater, crowds stretched for blocks. City lights was a triumph, proof that silent cinema could survive, that art could transcend technology. Charlie had won again. But he knew, even in that moment of victory, that he had only postponed the inevitable. The tramp would have to speak eventually, or the tramp would have to die. He chose a third option. He made the tramp's final film a howl of protest against the modern world, a 90-minute assault on industrialization and mechanization, and everything that was grinding human beings into interchangeable parts. Modern Times was released in 1936. It showed the tramp working in a factory, tightening bolts on an endless assembly line, driven mad by the repetition, sucked into the machinery itself. Funny and savage in equal measure, deeply political in ways critics immediately noticed. The FBI noticed too. The film contained almost no dialogue. The tramp still did not speak, but at the very end he sang a nonsense song, gibberish in no particular language, and it was the first time audiences had ever heard Charlie Chaplin's voice on film. It was also the last time the little tramp appeared on screen. The character who had made him famous, who had made him rich, who had made him immortal, walked off into the sunset at the end of Modern Times and never came back. In 1932, between the triumph of City Lights and the production of Modern Times, Charlie met someone different. Her name was Paulette Goddard. She was 21 years old, sophisticated, ambitious, intelligent. She knew what she wanted, and what she wanted, at least for a while, included Charlie Chaplin. They married secretly, probably in 1936, though the exact date was never confirmed. The secrecy cost Paulette dearly. During the casting of Gone with the Wind, she emerged as the leading candidate for Scarlett O'Hara, but the producers demanded proof that she was legally married to the man she was living with. Charlie refused to provide it. The role went to Vivien Leigh, and Paulette's chance at immortality slipped away. The marriage lasted about 6 years. It ended around 1942, amicably by the standards of Charlie's marriages. Paulette wanted children. Charlie already had 2 sons he barely saw. Paulette wanted independence. Charlie wanted control. They parted as friends and remained friends until his death. She was the one wife who escaped unscathed, the one who entered his life as an adult and left it as an adult, the one who seemed to genuinely like him, even after everything. When interviewers asked about him in later years, she smiled and changed the subject. Whatever she knew, she kept to herself. By the late 1930s, Charlie was watching the world darken. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany. Fascism was spreading across Europe, and Charlie noticed something that others had noticed too. He and Hitler looked remarkably alike. Both men were born in April 1889, 4 days apart. Both were small in stature. Both had the same toothbrush mustache, though Hitler had apparently adopted the style after seeing Charlie's films. The resemblance was uncanny, and Charlie understood immediately that it was a weapon. He began writing a film that would mock the most dangerous man in Europe. He would play two roles: a Jewish barber who survives the trenches of the Great War, and Adenoid Hinkle, the dictator of a fictional country called Tumania. The parallels to Hitler would be unmistakable. The production of The Great Dictator was troubled from the start. The American government, still officially neutral, worried about offending Germany. The studios refused to finance it. Charlie paid for everything himself, $2 million of his own money. The death threats arrived daily. Some were typed, some handwritten, some barely literate. Jew lover, one read. We know where you live. American Nazi sympathizers promised violence if the film was released. Some theaters announced they would refuse to show it. Charlie kept the threats in a drawer. He did not stop filming. The Great Dictator was released in October 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor, when American isolationism was still the dominant political mood. It was Charlie's first true talking picture, and he gave himself two voices. Hinkle spoke in nonsensical German-sounding gibberish. The barber spoke in English, gentle and kind, bewildered by the violence around him. The climax of the film broke every rule of cinema. The barber, through a series of mistaken identities, finds himself at a podium, expected to give a speech as the dictator. He looks out at the crowd. He looks into the camera. And then Charlie Chaplin stops playing a character and speaks directly to the audience. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor," he says. "That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible." What follows is a 6-minute speech about democracy, about humanity, about the machine age and greed and the better angels of our nature. It is passionate and earnest and completely sincere. It is also, some critics noted, completely out of place in a comedy. The character disappears. The mask drops. The man speaks. "To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people." The speech was controversial then and remains controversial now. Some called it brilliant, a brave use of celebrity to deliver a message the world needed to hear. Others called it naive, self-indulgent proof that Charlie Chaplin had confused being famous with being important. The FBI called it something else entirely. They called it evidence. Hitler, according to multiple sources, obtained a copy of the film and watched it twice. What he thought of it, no one knows. He never commented publicly. But he continued wearing the same mustache until the day he died in his bunker, the mustache that a comedian in California had worn first. Charlie once explained his approach to comedy. "Tell a joke once," he said, "and the audience laughs. Tell it twice and some will still laugh. Tell it 3 times and there is silence. Humor is not about what you say. It is about when and how you say it." The Great Dictator was the joke told at exactly the right moment. While the world hesitated, Charlie spoke. While governments calculated, he acted. The film became the biggest hit of his career. It was also the beginning of the end. In Washington, Edgar Hoover was adding pages to a file that had been growing for almost 20 years. The comedian who mocked Hitler had also given speeches calling for a second front to help the Soviet Union. The comedian who championed democracy had refused to become an American citizen. The entertainer who made everyone laugh was starting to make powerful people very angry. The trap was being set. All it needed was bait. Her name was Joan Barry, and she would provide exactly what Hoover needed. Not the truth, something better. A scandal so explosive that no amount of talent could survive it. 2 o'clock in the morning, June 1943. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence of the Beverly Hills mansion. Charlie Chaplin sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening. Another crash. footsteps on the stairs, and then she was in the doorway. Joan Barry was 23 years old, and she was holding a gun. She had climbed through a window, cutting herself on the broken glass. Blood ran down her arm, dripping onto the carpet. Her eyes were wild, unfocused, the eyes of someone who had not slept in days. She pointed the weapon at the most celebrated entertainer in America and began to speak. What she said that night would later be disputed. What is not disputed is that this was not her first break-in. She had been arrested at his home before, had been warned, had been given money to go away. She had not gone away. She had come back with a gun. The police were called. Joan was arrested. And in the morning, the newspapers had a story that would sell more copies than anything since Pearl Harbor. Charlie Chaplin and the woman with the gun. She had met him 2 years earlier in 1941. She was an aspiring actress, one of thousands who flooded Hollywood every year, hoping that beauty and ambition would be enough. She had auburn hair and a pleasant face and a desperation that Charlie recognized. He had seen it in the mirror long ago. He gave her a screen test. He gave her acting lessons. He gave her money, a car, an apartment. He gave her, according to later testimony, much more than that. The affair lasted perhaps a year, perhaps less. And then, as these things do, it ended. But Joan Barry did not end with it. She began appearing at his house uninvited. She made scenes at restaurants. She called at all hours. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic, increasingly frightening. Doctors who examined her later would use words like schizophrenia, would speak of delusions and paranoid episodes. But in 1943, she was simply called crazy, and crazy women were not believed. Except when it was convenient to believe them. In the autumn of that year, Joan announced that she was pregnant. The father, she claimed, was Charlie Chaplin. He denied it immediately and completely. He had not seen her in months. The timing was impossible. The accusation was absurd. But the accusation was also useful. Useful to Joan, who saw a chance at money and revenge. Useful to her lawyers, who saw a chance at fame. And useful to Edgar Hoover, who saw a chance at something he had been pursuing for more than 2 decades. The destruction of Charlie Chaplin. The FBI file on the comedian had been growing since 1922. It documented his political speeches, his refusal to become a citizen, his associations with people Hoover considered dangerous. It noted his support for the Soviet war effort, his calls for a second front in Europe, his general sympathy for working people and their struggles. None of this was illegal. None of it was even unusual. The Soviet Union was an American ally in 1943. Supporting the war effort was patriotic, but Hoover understood that politics alone would not destroy a man as beloved as Charlie Chaplin. He needed something else. He needed sex. The Joan Barry case provided exactly what he needed. The federal government charged Charlie with violating the Mann Act, a law passed in 1910 to combat sex trafficking. The law made it a crime to transport a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. The maximum sentence was 10 years in prison, though in extreme cases it could be extended to 23. The accusation was that Charlie had purchased train tickets for Joan to travel from Los Angeles to New York with the intention of having sexual relations with her. The evidence was thin. The interpretation of the law was strained, but the purpose was clear. This was not about justice. This was about punishment. The trial began in February 1944. The prosecution painted Charlie as a predator, a man who used his wealth and fame to exploit vulnerable women. The defense pointed out that whatever had happened between Charlie and Joan, it had been between consenting adults. Joan was 23, not 16. This was not another Lita Gray. More importantly, the defense demanded a blood test. The results were unambiguous. Charlie's blood type was O, Joan's was A. The baby's blood type was B. It was biologically impossible for Charlie to be the father. In any rational system, this would have ended the matter. Science had spoken. The accusation was false. But California law in 1944 did not accept blood tests as conclusive evidence of paternity. The jury was not required to believe the science. They were free to believe whatever they wanted to believe. On April 4, 1944, Charlie was acquitted of the Mann Act charges. The jury accepted that the federal government had overreached, that transporting a woman for immoral purposes required something more than buying train tickets for a former girlfriend. But the paternity case continued, and on a separate day, a different jury rendered a different verdict. Despite the blood tests, despite the scientific impossibility, Charlie Chaplin was ruled to be the father of Joan Barry's child. He was ordered to pay child support until the girl turned 21. He was ordered to pay for her education, her medical care, her every need. He was ordered to support a child that biology proved was not his. The verdict was a message, not from the jury alone but from something larger. The message was, we do not care about your science. We do not care about your evidence. We have decided that you are guilty, and guilty you will remain. In the galleries of the courtroom, observers noted a strange satisfaction on certain faces. The FBI agents who had provided information to Joan's lawyers, the gossip columnists who had spent years attacking Charlie in print, the politicians who had called him a communist and a threat to American values. They had won. Not completely, not yet, but they had drawn blood, and they would not stop until the job was finished. Through all of this, through the trials and the headlines and the humiliation, one person remained constant. Her name was Una O'Neill, and she was 18 years old. They had met at a dinner party in 1942. She was 17 then, the daughter of Eugene O'Neill, America's greatest playwright. Her father had abandoned her emotionally long before, too consumed by his art and his demons to notice his children. She had dark eyes and a serious face and a quietness that seemed to contain depths. Charlie was 53. The gap between them was more than years. It was the gap between someone who had lived through everything and someone who had lived through almost nothing. And yet something passed between them that night, some recognition, some connection that neither could fully explain. They married on June 16, 1943, while the Joan Barry scandal was still exploding around him. The Mann Act trial had not yet begun. The paternity suit was still pending. Charlie wanted the world to know that he was not destroyed, that he could still attract a beautiful young woman, that he was still Charlie Chaplin. Una's father, the playwright Eugene O'Neill, learned of the engagement from the newspapers. His reaction was immediate and absolute. He wrote his daughter a letter that no longer exists, but its contents were reported by those who saw its effects. He called her a fool. He called her worse than a fool. He told her that she was dead to him. He meant it. Eugene O'Neill never spoke to his daughter again. He never met his grandchildren. He died in 1953, 10 years after cutting her out of his life, without ever relenting. The cruelty of that silence was absolute. But Una did not waver. She married Charlie knowing what the world thought of him. She stood beside him during the trials. She gave him children, eventually 8 of them, more than he had ever imagined wanting. She made his home a sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the outside world could not enter. Whether this was love or need or something more complicated, only they knew. She was 18 when they married. He was 54. Some said she saved him. Others said she was simply another young woman caught in his orbit, another victim who did not recognize her victimhood. The truth, as always with human hearts, probably lies somewhere in between. They had their first child, Geraldine, in 1944. Michael followed in 1946. Josephine in 1949. The family grew even as the world outside grew more hostile. In 1947, Charlie released Monsieur Verdoux, a black comedy about a man who marries wealthy women and murders them for their money. It was brilliant, savage, unlike anything he had made before. The tramp was gone. In his place was something darker, a commentary on capitalism and war and the hypocrisies of respectable society. The film was a disaster. Critics attacked it as offensive. Audiences stayed away. In some cities, protesters picketed outside theaters. The American Legion called for a boycott. The Catholic Church condemned it. For the first time in his career, Charlie had made a film that America did not want to see. The House Un-American Activities Committee had been watching him for years. In 1947, they subpoenaed him to testify about his political beliefs. He never appeared. His lawyers argued, correctly, that he was not an American citizen and therefore not subject to the committee's jurisdiction. But the subpoena served its purpose. It told the world that Charlie Chaplin was under investigation, that he was suspected of being what they called a premature anti-fascist, that his loyalty was in question. The irony was bitter. He had made the great dictator when America was still selling steel to Germany. He had opposed Hitler when opposing Hitler was controversial. And now he was being investigated for being insufficiently American. By 1952, he knew that the end was coming. The political climate had grown poisonous. Senator Joseph McCarthy was destroying lives with accusations that did not require evidence. The blacklist was growing. Friends and colleagues were being ruined for the crime of having once attended a meeting or signed a petition. Charlie began to prepare. He transferred money to European banks. He made arrangements for his family to join him abroad if necessary, and he began work on what he knew might be his final American film. Limelight was the most personal work of his career. It told the story of Calvero, an aging comedian whose time has passed, who saves a young dancer from suicide and helps her find success even as his own career crumbles. At the end, Calvero performs one last time and dies in the wings, watching the woman he saved take her rightful place in the spotlight. It was autobiography barely disguised as fiction. Charlie was 63 years old. The tramp was gone. The scandals had taken their toll. He was not Calvero, not exactly, but he understood Calvero in a way that only someone facing his own mortality could understand. The film was completed in the summer of 1952. Charlie arranged for its premiere in London, where he still had admirers, where the political climate was less toxic. He would sail to England with his family, attend the premiere, perhaps take a brief vacation. He did not announce that he was leaving America. He did not say goodbye. He simply booked passage on the Queen Elizabeth and began to pack. The suitcases contained more than needed for a premiere. Much more. Perhaps he already knew what was coming. Perhaps he simply wanted to be prepared. On September 17, 1952, the ship sailed from New York Harbor. Charlie stood on deck with Una and their 4 children, watching the skyline recede. He had lived in America for 38 years. He had made his fortune there, found his fame there, raised his children there. He was leaving it all behind. 2 days later, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the radio message arrived. Attorney General James McGranary had signed an order revoking Charlie's re-entry permit. If he wanted to return to America, he would have to submit to an immigration hearing. He would have to answer questions about his political beliefs, his moral character, his fitness to be readmitted. The order cited moral turpitude and communist sympathies. It referenced the Joan Barry case, the political speeches, the refusal to become a citizen. It did not mention that the blood tests had proved him innocent of paternity. It did not mention that he had never been a member of the Communist Party. It did not mention that his crime, in the end, was being unpopular with powerful people. Charlie read the message and understood immediately what it meant. He could fight, hire lawyers, demand hearings, try to clear his name, or he could accept that America had made its decision and move on. He chose to move on. Una sailed back to California alone. She closed the studio. She sold the house. She liquidated everything they owned in America. She packed up their lives and brought them to Europe, to the man who was waiting for her, to the new life they would build together. They settled in Switzerland, in a village called Vevey on the shores of Lake Geneva. The house was called the Manoir de Ban, a white mansion surrounded by gardens, with a view of the Alps in the distance. It would be their home for the rest of his life. The exile had begun. The first Christmas in Switzerland was the strangest. Snow on the mountains, a tree in the hall, children who did not understand why they could not go home. Una made it festive. She always made everything festive. But Charlie sat by the window looking at the Alps, thinking of California, the sunshine, the studio, the life that had been taken from him. For 20 years, Charlie Chaplin did not set foot in America. His films were not distributed there. His name was rarely spoken in polite company. He became a ghost, a memory, someone that older people remembered and younger people had never heard of. He continued to work. In 1957, he made A King in New York, a bitter satire about McCarthyism and American paranoia. The film was banned in America. Critics elsewhere found it uneven, the work of a man whose anger had overwhelmed his artistry. But it contained moments of genuine brilliance, flashes of the old magic, proof that the talent had not died even if the welcome had. The children kept coming. Victoria in 1951, Eugene in 1953, Jane in 1957, Annette in 1959, Christopher in 1962. 8 children in all with Una, plus the 2 sons from his marriage to Lita Gray who rarely visited, who belonged to another life, another country, another version of their father. The household in Vevey was something out of another century. Charlie ruled it like a benevolent patriarch, setting schedules, demanding punctuality, insisting on formal dinners where the children were expected to participate in adult conversation. He played tennis into his 70s. He composed music for his old films. He wrote his autobiography, carefully omitting anything that might reflect poorly on him. Una managed everything else. She ran the household, raised the children, protected her husband from the world and the world from her husband. Visitors who came to the Manoir de Ban found her gracious, attentive, always slightly in the background. She had given up everything for this man, her country, her father, her youth. Whether she ever regretted it, she never said. The rehabilitation began slowly. In the 1960s, a new generation discovered Charlie's films. Young people who had no memory of the scandals watched The Kid and City Lights and Modern Times and saw something that spoke to them. The counterculture embraced the little tramp as one of their own, an outsider who had challenged the establishment and paid the price. Film scholars began to write about him seriously, analyzing his technique, his influence, his place in cinema history. Retrospectives were organized. Old prints were restored. The work began to separate from the life, or at least to exist alongside it. In 1967, he made his final film. A Countess from Hong Kong starred Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren, 2 of the biggest names in the world. It was a romantic comedy, old-fashioned in style, a throwback to an earlier era. Critics were respectful but unenthusiastic. Audiences stayed away. The magic, whatever had made him special, seemed finally to have faded. Charlie was 77 years old. He had been making films for more than half a century. He had invented a character that had changed the world, and now it was over. The invitation came in 1972. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences wanted to give Charlie Chaplin an honorary Oscar. They wanted him to come to Los Angeles, to stand on stage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, to receive the recognition that his own country had denied him for so long. It was not quite an apology. The government had not rescinded its order. The FBI file had not been closed. Edgar Hoover, still alive, still powerful, still opposed the visit. But the Academy proceeded anyway, and somehow, improbably, the Nixon administration allowed it. Charlie was 82 years old. His health was fragile. The journey would be difficult, but he agreed to come. On April 10, 1972, Charlie Chaplin returned to America for the first time in 20 years. The ceremony that night would become legendary. When his name was announced, the audience rose. They began to applaud. They did not stop. The ovation lasted 12 minutes. It remains the longest in Oscar history. Charlie stood on stage, a small white-haired figure, tears streaming down his face. He tried to speak but could not. The applause continued, wave after wave, washing over him like absolution. When it finally subsided, he managed a few words. "Words are so futile, so feeble," he said. His voice was thin, breaking. "This is a deeply moving moment for me." The award citation praised him for the incalculable effect he has had in making motion pictures the art form of this century. It was not quite enough. Nothing could be quite enough after everything that had happened. But it was something. He stayed in America only briefly. He visited old haunts, met old friends, most of whom were dead or dying. The country that had exiled him had changed beyond recognition. He had changed too. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to prove. He returned to Switzerland, to Una and the children, to the quiet life he had built in exile. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Edgar Hoover died. The man who had pursued Charlie for 30 years, who had compiled 2,000 pages of surveillance, who had engineered his exile, did not live to see the rehabilitation completed. Charlie outlived his persecutor. It was a small victory, but it was victory nonetheless. The knighthood came in 1975. Queen Elizabeth II tapped him on the shoulder with a sword, and he became Sir Charles Chaplin. He was 85 years old, too frail to kneel, but he managed a bow. The honor that Britain had delayed for decades, partly at American pressure, was finally his. The final years were quiet. His health declined. He suffered small strokes that left him increasingly confused. He spent his days in a wheelchair, looking out at the lake and the mountains, sometimes recognizing visitors and sometimes not. Una read to him. She played his music. She never left his side. On Christmas morning, 1977, Charlie Chaplin died in his sleep at the Manoir de Ban. He was 88 years old. He had been the world's most recognized entertainer. He had been a genius and perhaps a monster. He had made millions laugh and made some women cry. He had been worshipped and exiled and rehabilitated. And now he was gone. But death, it turned out, was not the end of the story. On March 1, 1978, someone dug up his grave. The body was stolen in the middle of the night. The thieves left behind only an empty coffin and a ransom demand. They wanted $600,000 for the return of Charlie Chaplin's remains. Una refused to pay. Charlie would have thought it ridiculous, she told the police. She was right. He would have found it absurd, the kind of grotesque comedy that he might have invented himself. The little tramp, stolen from his final resting place, held hostage by criminals who did not understand that the joke was on them. The police traced the calls. 11 weeks after the theft, they found the body buried in a cornfield a few miles from the cemetery. The thieves were a Polish refugee and an unemployed Bulgarian auto mechanic. Their plan had been foolish from the start. They were arrested, tried, convicted. Charlie was reburied in a vault encased in concrete, too heavy to move. This time, he would stay where he was put. Even in death, Charlie Chaplin could not escape drama, but the questions he left behind were more troubling than any grave robbery. The wives were still alive, most of them. The children were still processing. The FBI files were waiting to be opened. The reckoning was coming, whether anyone wanted it or not. 1995. A small house in a quiet neighborhood, somewhere in California. A woman sits in a chair by the window, watching the afternoon light fade. She is 87 years old, and she has been answering the same question for 70 years. A journalist sits across from her, recorder running, notepad ready. The question comes as it always does. What was Charlie Chaplin really like? Lita Gray does not blink. Her eyes are clear, her voice steady. 7 decades have not softened her memory or her judgment. He was the most talented man I ever met, she says, and the cruelest. She has told this story so many times that it has become polished, each detail in its place, each pause calculated for effect. But there is something beneath the polish, something that still burns after all these years. She was 15 when he first touched her, 16 when she married him, 17 when she realized what she had done. People ask me if I hate him, she continues. I don't think hate is the right word. Hate requires energy. What I feel is something older than hate, something colder. She pauses, looking out the window at the California sun. He gave me 2 sons. He gave me money. He gave me a story that followed me my entire life. Every time I met someone new, I could see them calculating. Is this the woman from the divorce papers? Is this the girl who almost destroyed Charlie Chaplin? She turns back to the journalist. I didn't almost destroy him, he almost destroyed me, but I survived. That's what people forget, I survived. Lita Gray died later that year, having outlived her ex-husband by nearly 2 decades. Her obituaries mention the divorce, of course. They always mention the divorce. But they also mention that she had raised her sons, that she had lived a life beyond those 2 terrible years. Survival, in the end, was its own form of victory. Mildred Harris, the first wife, had not been so fortunate. She had tried to rebuild her career after the divorce, but the studios had no interest in Charlie Chaplin's discarded wife. She took small roles, then smaller ones, then none at all. She married twice more, divorced twice more. In the end, she was working as a nurse when illness took her in 1944. She was 42 years old. The newspapers gave her death a single paragraph. Former wife of Charlie Chaplin. The headlines read, "Even in death she was defined by him." Paulette Goddard took a different approach. She said almost nothing. After her divorce from Charlie, she remarried twice, first to the actor Burgess Meredith, then to the novelist Erich Maria Remarque. She became a successful actress in her own right, earned an Oscar nomination, built a career that had nothing to do with the man she had once loved. When interviewers asked about Charlie, she smiled and changed the subject. When biographers came calling, she was polite but unhelpful. She died in 1990 at 78 years old, having kept her secrets to the end. Whatever she knew about the years they spent together, whatever she had seen or heard or understood, she took with her to the grave. Her silence was deliberate. It was also impenetrable. And then there was Una. People wondered about her, this woman who had given up everything for a man old enough to be her grandfather. Had she been happy? Had she been trapped? Had she known about the others, the young girls before her, the pattern she had interrupted or continued? Her children offered conflicting accounts. Some remembered an idyllic childhood, a father who was present and engaged, a mother who made everything possible. Others remembered tension, distance, the weight of living in the shadow of someone so famous. The truth, as always with families, was probably all of these things at once. Geraldine, the eldest daughter, learned to navigate interviews with diplomatic precision, neither condemning nor excusing, holding contradictions without trying to resolve them. "He was a complicated man," she said in one interview. "All geniuses are complicated. I loved him. I also understand why others didn't." Michael, the second child, searched for meaning in religion, moving from one faith to another, never quite finding what he was looking for. Perhaps he was searching for his father. Perhaps he was searching for escape from his father. The distinction was not always clear. The younger children born in exile had different memories. They had never known America, never felt the weight of the scandals, never understood why their father could not go home. For them, Switzerland was simply home, and their father was simply their father, an old man who played tennis and composed music, and told stories about a world that no longer existed. Charles Jr.'s story was the darkest. The elder son from the Lita Gray marriage had grown up caught between 2 parents who despised each other, shuttled back and forth, never quite belonging anywhere. He became an actor, but not a successful one. He became a writer, producing a memoir that painted his father in unflattering colors. He became an alcoholic, following the path that his grandfather had walked before him. He died in 1968 at 42 years old. A blood clot in his leg traveled to his lungs. He was found alone in his apartment. His father, living in Switzerland by then, did not attend the funeral. Some said Charlie was too frail to travel. Others said he simply did not care. The truth was probably somewhere in between. He had never been close to his first two sons. They were reminders of a marriage he wanted to forget, products of a time he had spent decades trying to erase. Their pain was real, but it was not his pain, and he had never learned to carry anything but his own. Sidney Earle, the second son, fared better. He had a successful career on Broadway, earned a Tony nomination, lived until 2009. But even he could not entirely escape his father's shadow. Every interview circled back to the same questions. What was it like? How did it feel? What do you remember? He remembered silence mostly. Long dinners where children were expected to listen, not speak. A father who was present but not quite there, whose mind was always on the next film, the next scene, the next problem to solve. He remembered loving his father and not quite being able to reach him. The women told their stories. The children told theirs. But there was another archive, another set of documents that told a different story entirely. The FBI file on Charlie Chaplin was released in 1984 under the Freedom of Information Act. 2,063 pages, 30 years of surveillance, the complete record of the United States government's obsession with a comedian. Reading the file is a strange experience. The language is bureaucratic, the tone clinical. Agent reports describe his movements, his meetings, his phone calls. Informants provide gossip and speculation. Hoover himself annotates certain pages in his distinctive handwriting, adding comments, underlining passages, directing his agents to dig deeper. Page 412 contains a report from an informant inside Charlie's studio. The informant's name is redacted, but the details suggest someone close, someone trusted. Subject spoke favorably of Russian workers. The report notes, subject believes capitalism is failing. These words, written by a spy, would follow Charlie for decades. The picture that emerges is not of a dangerous subversive, but of a famous man living his life under a microscope. He attended parties where suspected communists were present. He gave speeches that praised the Soviet war effort. He associated with people who held left-wing views. None of this was illegal. None of it was even particularly unusual for Hollywood in the 1940s. But Hoover had decided that Charlie Chaplin was the enemy, and once Hoover decided something, he did not change his mind. The file grew and grew, adding new allegations, new suspicions, new reasons to keep watching. When the Joan Barry case presented an opportunity, the FBI was ready. Agents provided information to her lawyers. They helped build the case. They turned a paternity dispute into a political weapon. The Mann Act charges were Hoover's idea. The law had been designed to combat human trafficking, to protect women from exploitation. Using it against a man who had bought train tickets for his girlfriend was a perversion of its intent. But Hoover understood that the charge itself was the punishment. Even acquittal would not undo the damage. The exile order in 1952 was the culmination of 3 decades of work. Hoover had finally found a way to remove his enemy from American soil. The official justification was moral turpitude and communist sympathies. The real reason was simpler. Charlie Chaplin had made powerful people angry, and powerful people had found a way to make him pay. There is a certain irony in the timing. Hoover died in May 1972, just weeks after Charlie's triumphant return to the Academy Awards. He never saw the standing ovation. He never saw the tears, the applause, the reconciliation that he had spent 30 years trying to prevent. The comedian outlived the bureaucrat. The artist outlived the persecutor. But the victory, if it was a victory, came too late. 20 years of exile cannot be undone by 12 minutes of applause. The damage was permanent. The wound never fully healed. What do we do with complicated geniuses? This is the question that haunts every discussion of Charlie Chaplin, every retrospective, every attempt to assess his legacy. The defenders say he was a product of his time. The age of consent was different then. The power dynamics were different. He should be judged by the standards of his era, not ours. The critics say that exploitation is exploitation, regardless of era. A 35-year-old man pursuing a 15-year-old girl was wrong in 1924, and it remains wrong today. The passage of time does not transform cruelty into acceptability. Both arguments have merit, neither is complete. The complication is that both things are true simultaneously. The FBI persecution was real. The government did target him for his political beliefs. The exile was unjust. And also, he pursued teenage girls throughout his adult life. He married children and discarded them when they grew inconvenient. He left damage in his wake that lasted for generations. Can we hold both truths at once? Can we watch City Lights and weep at its beauty while knowing what we know about the man who made it? Can art be separated from artist, or are they forever entangled? There is no consensus. Perhaps there never will be. The Chaplin Museum in Vevey, Switzerland, navigates these waters carefully. It celebrates his artistic achievements, his technical innovations, his influence on generations of filmmakers. It acknowledges in carefully worded panels that his personal life was controversial. It does not dwell on the details. It does not show visitors the divorce documents or the FBI files or the testimony of the women who loved him and were destroyed by him. This is understandable. Museums are in the business of celebration, not condemnation. But the omissions are also a kind of erasure, a smoothing over of rough edges that deserve to remain rough. Geraldine Chaplin has thought about these questions more than most. She has lived with them her entire life. In interviews, she holds the contradiction without trying to resolve it. "I loved my father," she says. "I still love him, but I also know things about him that are difficult to love. I don't think those two facts cancel each other out. I think they coexist." This is perhaps the most honest answer anyone has given. The coexistence of contradictory truths, the refusal to simplify, the acknowledgement that human beings are not puzzles to be solved but mysteries to be contemplated. The films remain. City Lights is still shown in theaters around the world. The final scene still makes people cry. The flower girl still touches the tramp's hand, and something passes between them that requires no words, no explanation, no context. It is pure cinema, pure emotion, pure art. The kid still breaks hearts. The little boy being taken away by the authorities. The tramp climbing across rooftops to get him back. The desperation of a man who has finally found something worth fighting for. Modern times still resonates. The assembly line, the feeding machine, the worker as cog in a vast mechanical system. Nearly 90 years later, the critique still feels relevant, perhaps more relevant than ever. The great dictator still speaks. The final speech, with its plea for humanity and hope, still moves audiences. The hate of men will pass and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. These works exist independently of their creator. They have lives of their own. They touch people who know nothing about Lita Gray or Joan Barry or the FBI files. They communicate something universal, something that transcends biography. Does this matter? Does the beauty of the work compensate for the ugliness of the life? Can we enjoy the art without endorsing the artist? These are not questions with answers. They are questions with arguments, positions, perspectives. They are questions that each person must wrestle with alone. A film student in 2024 watches City Lights for the first time. The final scene, the recognition, the hope and the fear in his eyes. She weeps, not quite knowing why. Then she searches his name on the internet. She reads about the wives, the ages, the patterns. She reads about the FBI and the exile and the body snatchers. She closes her laptop and looks at the screen where the image is frozen on the tramp's face, hopeful and afraid. She does not know what to think. She does not know how to hold both things at once, the beauty and the ugliness, the laughter and the tears. Nobody does. That is the point. We return one final time to the Atlantic Ocean. September 1952. The Queen Elizabeth plowing through dark water, a small figure on the deck, looking at nothing, thinking of everything. He is 63 years old. Behind him lies America, the country that invented him, worshipped him, and expelled him. Ahead lies England, the country that starved him but never stopped claiming him. He belongs to neither place now. He belongs only to the space between. In his pocket is the telegram from Una, 4 words, "We are coming too." In his cabin are the reels of Limelight, his last American film, about an old comedian who knows his time has passed. On screen, the character dies at the end, collapsing in the wings while a younger generation takes the spotlight. Art imitating life or life imitating art. The distinction has long since ceased to matter. He will live 25 more years. He will have 4 more children with Una. He will make 2 more films. He will be knighted by the Queen. He will stand on a stage in Los Angeles while thousands applaud for 12 unbroken minutes. But tonight on the Atlantic, he knows none of this. He knows only that behind him is everything he built, and ahead is everything he does not yet understand. He thinks of his mother, perhaps, Hannah, who sang in music halls until her voice broke. Hannah, who went mad and came back and went mad again. Hannah, who died in California without ever understanding what her son had become. He thinks of his father, perhaps, the drunk who abandoned them, the stranger in the street, the grave he never visited. He thinks of the women, perhaps, Mildred, who was 16, Lita, who was 15, Una, who was 18, the pattern that he could not break or would not break or did not want to break. He thinks of his sons, perhaps, Charles and Sidney growing up without him, the boys he barely knew, the damage he had done and would continue to do. He thinks of the tramp, perhaps, the character who had made him rich, made him famous, made him immortal, the little man with the cane and the hat and the hopeful walk, the one who always got up after being knocked down, the one who always walked toward the horizon at the end, alone but not defeated. The tramp was gone now. He had walked off into the sunset at the end of modern times and never come back, but something of him remained. Something of him would always remain, as long as people watched the films, as long as they laughed and cried at the stories he had told. Charlie stands at the railing as the sky begins to lighten. The stars fade one by one into the gray of dawn. He is tired, but he cannot sleep. There will be time for sleep later. There will be time for everything later. For now, there is only the ocean and the ship and the man who made the world laugh, standing alone in the space between what was and what will be. He turns from the railing at last. He walks back toward his cabin, his step still steady, his posture still straight. 88 years old he will be when death finally catches him, but that is a quarter century away, an eternity, a lifetime. Tonight he is 63, and he is starting over. The door closes behind him. The deck is empty. The ship sails on, carrying its cargo of films and memories and questions that will never be answered. And somewhere in all those reels of film, the little tramp is still walking, still getting up after every fall, still tipping his hat to pretty girls, still finding hope in hopeless places. Getting smaller. Getting smaller. Gone. That was the story of Charlie Chaplin, a man who rose from a London workhouse to become the most celebrated entertainer on earth, who made the whole world laugh while carrying sorrows most of us cannot imagine. His story does not end with easy answers. Perhaps that is why it still matters, nearly 50 years after his death. The questions he left behind are the questions we still ask ourselves. How do we hold complexity? How do we love imperfect people? How do we remember those who were both extraordinary and flawed? These questions have no final answers, but perhaps asking them is enough. Thank you for listening.